Hello and welcome to I Can't History. Today we'll be talking about the American imperialism and World War I. For starters, this time period would happen around the same time as the Progressive Era, that has been previously covered in my last video. As America finished expanding westward, America began to believe that they needed to help other countries and spread their ideals. In 1893, a man by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner would speak about how Americans would need a place to expand after taking all of the land westwards. A poem by the name of White Man's Burden was written by Rudyard Kipling, which would encourage the idea of expanding the ideals of a white American society for the sake of the weaker and smaller nations. In 1986, the Secretary of State at the time, named William Seward, would buy Alaska from the Russians. Seward would be criticized for this purchase by both Congress and the people, calling the state Seward's folly. But critics would be proven wrong, as the state proved valuable, with all of the resources that would make the purchase a success. Hawaii's affairs were something that the US already was interfering with, since that was the location of Pearl Harbor and the US already had established sugar plantations in that area. In 1891, the last monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani would rebel against the American economy and influence. The revolution was not a success, however, as the Queen was overthrown in 1993 by businesses and the US Marines. Hawaii was later annexed as an American territory in 1898 and officially became the 50th state in 1959. China was a golden opportunity for several countries to expand markets and garner resources. Different European countries would divide China into different economic regions. The US was afraid of losing opportunities and influence over the country, and so America would make an agreement with several European countries, also known as the Open Door Policy of 1899. Some Chinese, however, wasn't exactly fond of foreign influence, and so they would proceed to kill foreigners and those who accepted the foreigners in their religions. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 would lead to thousands of Chinese deaths, and America would gain even more economic influence in China. The Spanish-American War first started with the tension between Spain and Cuba. Spain would control one of its last remaining colonies through violence and intimidation, and Cuba wasn't exactly fond of their mother country. The US would offer to buy Cuba, but was rejected in 1854. Despite this, the US was still very invested in Cuban sugar plantations. The Cuba Libre movement in 1895 was a revolution started by Jose Marti. Cuban fighters would destroy Spanish and American sugar plantations. Destruction of the latter mostly being ways to provoke Americans to help Cuba fight against Spain. Yellow journalism in America would begin to spark conversations over Spain, as competing papers would create mass amounts of exposure for the sake of selling more paper than rivals. In 1898, the Delhomme letter would be exposing the Spanish ambassador's opinion of President McKinley being weak, which in turn would further anger Americans. However, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine would explode, killing over 250 people, and Spain was blamed for that explosion, despite any lack of evidence over what truly caused the explosion. April 20th, 1898 would be the date that America declared war on Spain. America would later go on to win the war, but would refuse to claim Cuba through the Teller Amendment. During the Spanish-American War, America would help the Philippines gain independence from Spain. The only difference between the Philippines and Cuba is that America would take control of the Philippines, leading to the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902. The Philippines would lose that war and would stay in American control until 1946. America would be in an armistice with Spain, with the Treaty of Paris signed, leaving Cuba free and Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines being in American control. In 1901, Roosevelt would create his foreign policy where America would police affairs in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt would help create a stronger navy and would help Panama rebel against Cuba, just so they could build the Panama Canal. In 1909, Taft would establish his foreign policy of investment in Latin America and financial intervention of these countries over militaristic interventions. In 1913, Wilson would create his own policy where interference in Latin American countries will only happen with countries that are non-oppressive and uphold democratic beliefs. World War I began due to tension caused by different countries in Europe. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand would create a domino effect, with several countries declaring war against each other. World War I would introduce the more modern form of warfare, as trench warfare became an important aspect of modern warfare. World War I would also introduce the modern weapons such as tanks and machine guns, which would proceed to define modern weaponry. Americans during this time would keep their policy of neutrality, as European problems are something America did not want to deal with. However, after a series of German interference, such as the sinking of Lusitania and the interception of the Zimmermann telegram, Wilson began to advocate for American intervention in World War I. In 1917, Wilson would proceed to ask Congress to join World War I, and with Congress's consent, the US entered World War I. During the war, America began to advertise to the people to help with war efforts. Food, fuel, and funds were raised to help with war efforts. The government also criminalized the criticization of the US government and military efforts in World War I through the Espionage and Sedition Act. In 1917, the Russian Empire would fall and the USSR would stand in its place and pull itself out of the war. By 1918, Germans would agree to an armistice, and the world leaders would meet in the Palace of Versailles in 1919. Wilson would introduce 14 points, which include the creation of the League of Nations. Most of the Allied nations wouldn't agree with most of the points, with the League of Nations being the exception. In the end, the treaty would create the League of Nations, create 9 new countries, and punish Germany severely by making them take the blame, the debt, and forcing them to be unable to keep a military. But it doesn't end there, because the Senate never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. The Senate, with concerns over European interference, would never ratify the treaty, and so the US would not adopt the treaty or join the League of Nations. Wilson would tour the country to try to advertise for the ratification of the treaty, but would never get it ratified after he dies from a stroke. In the election of 1920, the 29th president, Warren G. Harding, would return America to its isolationism and officially end the era of the Great War. If you liked this video, then please consider subscribing. If you want some gaming content, then go to my main channel in the description below. Other than that, thank you for watching.